Wow, this is a very multi-layered question. But going back to those key themes about identity and advocacy and my decision to stay in California and go to a Cal State, which I know that some people just don't get because there's this kind of stigma about the Cal State system that's not as prestigious as the UC system, which I don't buy into at all. At one point, I had thought about applying straight to PhDs in the Midwest. So I'm thinking like University of Michigan, Indiana, University of Bloomington, all really great, prestigious educational opportunities with great funding. But when you look at the brochures, there's very little people of color. And I knew some people who had also gone on to there. They said the same thing, great education, amazing opportunities, but very isolated, especially if you don't find community there. And I just didn't want that lifestyle for myself. I didn't want to be apart from my family for so many years, and then if something were to happen, I would be on the other side of the country. And more than that, I would just feel lost and potentially unsafe, because it's hard when you're a woman, especially if you're a woman of color, out there on your own, to make that commitment to reach for something higher, like a higher education, and feeling like you're doing it with no support. So that was really important to me, to stay close to home so that I could visit my family and find my community, which is why I stayed at CSU Northridge, and it's been a great choice. There are really great people here, and not even outside of Northridge, I've been able to find community. It's been fantastic. So what I got out of my college experience being a Latinx woman, I feel very empowered. Before I came to this college here at CSU Northridge, I had gone out of my immediate area once. I went to Cal State Channel Islands for my BA, but before that I had never left my community. I have been in this very small farming community. It's called Orosi. It's barely on the map, and it is 50 minutes from Fresno, but I tell everybody I'm from Fresno. It is almost 100% Hispanic, or whatever term you want to speak to that, Hispanic, Latinx, you decide. And I love my community to this day still, but it was very, it got to the point it was kind of suffocating. I did need to leave at some point. And when I went to college, I really kind of just fell in love with the community again. You see people from similar backgrounds really struggle and really reach for something which could open doors to them, a higher education. And I find that very admirable. And sometimes there's doors in their way, and I really want to be one of the people that help open those doors, which is why I really chose to get my degree, my master's in higher education leadership and policy. I think there's so many ways that leaders in colleges, universities can implement policies and also make programs that make colleges more accessible and more welcoming and more inviting to students of color, especially like students like me, Latinx women of color, in fields like STEM, or that aren't traditionally like pathways that students of color are shoved into. And that's really just important to me to do and maintain going forward. You know what? There is a lot of issues with living in somewhere so rural. I mean, there's great sides too, no traffic at all. Excellent produce. There are good people there too. But there are very limited educational opportunities. So like where I'm from, CSU Fresno is the only public CSU. There is one private nearby, but the cost of tuition is quite steep. And our newest UC was built like about 15 years ago, and it's still 2 hours out. So really CSU Fresno is the only public university really accessible to people, and that kind of reflects as well at the lower level too, at high schools, elementary schools. And so I really wanted to really not go to the local high school. I was advised not to attend. They would immediately track me into programs not suited for me. I was advised to go to a small charter school that still served students from the agricultural community that was accepting applications at the time. It's the high school of about 330 students, and I really made a commitment to go there. I would wake up at like 6 in the morning to take 2 buses to get there, about 40 minutes away, and then take 2 buses back because I would go take night classes at the community college after high school. And so I would get home like at about 9 p.m. And it was a really big commitment. I would do that for several years. I gave up all my summers to go to college because I had this notion in my head, or not notion, I realized very early on that college was going to be very expensive and I did not want to put that financial burden on myself or my family, because my sister was only 3 years younger than me. So we would both be in the same age group of going to college around the same time. So I thought that it was my responsibility to do as much as I could to alleviate that burden for myself and for her and for the rest of my family. So I don't regret it at all, but I really did spend a lot of time doing as much as I could to get those college credits down early while also going to school. Yeah.
So you were a dual enrollment student?
I was. And that took like a lot of time and energy. I'm not going to lie. I gave up so many summers going to classes. I maxed them out. I did them on the side as well after high school. And then I took an extra year after high school as well. I think that kind of ties into like what struggles have you been into. Let me just say this was right before the law that said that I can't remember what it's called, AB something, that you could just straight up take that upper division math to transfer. This was back when you had to take the placement test, and then they would place you in whatever math class, and you would start from there. And so back in those days, I placed into pre-algebra. So I had to take pre-algebra, then algebra 1, then algebra 2, and then finally the one stats class I needed to take. And this was kind of crushing because at that time, I had applied to 4-year universities, and then I had gotten scholarships to go to CSU Monterey Bay as a history major. But at the very last minute, I failed that stats class by less than a point. Less than a point. This was back in the days of Blackboard where you can see the exact percentage. And so I had to call back on my scholarship providers and say, like, I apologize. I can't take your scholarship this time. I did not qualify to transfer. I had to cancel my dorm application. It was really traumatic. I did finally pass stats, but it took a year later. And at that time, they'd finally waived the requirement that you needed to take prior classes depending on the placement test. And so that was just like, wow, for me. And I did end up transferring. I went down south instead of north. I majored in psychology, and I've made it a really good life for myself. So I don't think it was a mistake at all. I do sometimes wonder what would have happened if I went north instead of south, hold for major, but I'm very happy with my life. I think that I was placed where I was for a reason. How many professors of color did I have? You know what? I think the most professors of color I ever had were at my community college. Back in that little agricultural farming community, I went to a community college called College Sequoias. It was in Visalia, California. And I think that might have been where I had the most professors of color. I would say almost half of them were of color, which is pretty high comparatively. When I went to the CSU for my BA, CSU Child Islands, I would say that number dropped dramatically. I think I maybe had no professors of color. The professors of color that would qualify were international professors. They came from out of the country, which respect to, but it does not quite fit the question of were there American-born professors of color. I feel like the international category is something entirely different. And as to my current program, as a master's student, it's mostly lecturer-based, but I would say that they've almost entirely been professors of color. I will not lie. With the exception of one or two, they've almost entirely been professors of color. But again, most of them have been lecturers who have been contracted for 1 or 2 classes, and they're not full-time faculty here. There's only one full-time faculty member for my program, and she is of color. But I think we could still do a lot better, which is why, again, I'm really passionate about the field that I'm intending to go into, higher education. And I've really made it a point to learn more about why we have these policies, why we can't hire more professors of color, because it seems like a simple fix. And I could talk about this forever, but I won't. But it has a lot to do with hiring contracts and the proportion of like people we hire in a given year. And so I do see the logic of why we can't just outright cancel contracts, because that's also unfair for the faculty who are currently are teaching that aren't of color. But I do have a lot of faith for California specifically. I have faith for the rest of the country, but California really is trying to pave a way forward as an example of how we can hire diversely while also still being just. And so I'm really trying to be a part of that as well. Because I think that's super important to have faculty who look like you and can represent you and can be a guide and a mentor for you, especially if you don't see yourself in those classrooms. Oh, wow, there's so many people. The first and most obvious person is my mom. And there's so many people. I'm just gonna talk about my mom though. My mom has been my inspiration forever, and she always will be. And I don't think she thinks of herself the same way, because she's just a like 4th, 5th grade elementary school teacher. She's been for the past 20 plus years. But she really is my inspiration. I've learned how to be strong from her example. She's originally from like Mexico, and not a very wealthy part of Mexico. She lived in a very rural area. She lived in a mud house, an adobe home with like 11 siblings. And they wanted her to marry very young. They had aspirations for her that did not involve school. She used to get punished for going to school instead of helping in the fields. But when she was 16, she said that she wanted to leave the country by herself. And that was extremely brave. It was the 1980s. She didn't speak English and she had no contacts in America, but she came here by herself. She was immediately placed in foster care. And again, she didn't speak any English. But she worked several jobs to afford textbooks. She was shuffled around place to place, but she went to college, she got her degree, and she sent a lot of students to school for the better. And she's really been my inspiration that I can do big things too. Hi, Mom. I'm really proud to make you proud. I'm feeling kind of emotional thinking about it. I'll see you soon.